Good afternoon. My name is Nate Schutta. I work for VMware. Best way to describe me is architect as a service. That's pretty much what I do. I go places, talk to people mostly about architecture. I do recommend you don't sound that acronym out in your head. The first time someone called me that, I realized it may not actually have been a compliment, but I'm trying to take it in the most positive sense I possibly can.
Cool. My name is Dan Vega. I'm a Spring developer advocate for VMware. I've been doing this for about 22 years or so, not this position, but definitely being in the position of learning new things and be able to teach them back to the community. I've done that most of my career, so I really enjoy what I get to do now. And we're gonna have some fun with this today.
I hope so. I'm not gonna say that Dan and I chose these shirts to be like yin and yang, architect, developer, but I'm not gonna say that that wasn't a deliberate choice. I guess it just is the way things work sometimes. So we're gonna walk you through some recipes. You know, if you were in the keynote this morning, one of the things that stood out to me is just this evolution that we've seen in Spring and the evolution that we've seen just in software writ large and the fact that Spring has moved along in that journey as well. And so one of the challenges that means for us is there's a lot of stuff in there and it's hard to keep up. Now I think Dan and I had the luxury, the good fortune, the good timing, whatever you want, of growing up with this. You know, I think about all these things that have come into our industry and I just kind of got to learn a lot of it incrementally. And I didn't fully appreciate that until a few years ago. I was talking with somebody and I mentioned that, well, you know, that's just a standard Goff pattern. And this person just kind of looked at me. I said, yeah, you know, it's just a standard Gang of Four pattern. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, the Gang of Four. You've read the Gang of Four book, right? And he's like, nope. I had to Google the book to remember what the actual title was because it's just Gang of Four to me. And so I showed that to him. He's like, nope, never heard of it. And I'm like, okay, all right. Good reminder to me that there's some stuff that I was maybe taking for granted. And so when you look at the Spring ecosystem, there's a lot of there. And it can be overwhelming, especially if you're new to it.
Yeah.
And you think, oh my God, how am I gonna learn all of this? You know, bit by bit, to say the least. Now again, some of us had the good fortune of sort of growing up with this incrementally, and so it wasn't this massive sort of, oh my gosh, I need to learn this all in 6 months. You know, and by the way, this is a perennial issue in our space, right? There's always new things to play with. And so what we're gonna try to do here today is cut through at least some of that confusion, and certainly some of the things we're gonna show you are not going to be new to you, but they're gonna be new to somebody, right? And our hope is that there's at least a few things in here like, oh, I didn't realize that Spring could solve that problem for me as well. One of the challenges that we face in this space is the fact that these are all tools. This is one of these things I think about a lot as an architect. Developers, we tend to get really excited about something and it's like, I need to use this. Why? Because I want to put it on my resume. And we have to remember that we need to know when to pick up which tool and when should we apply this and when is that a really bad idea. And so that's part of what we're going to get through here today. So we'll talk a little bit about getting started, Spring Boot, web applications near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of my career building enterprise web apps. Databases, long the bane of my existence, thank goodness for Spring, things like Spring Data, or else I'd never be able to talk to a database. Spring Cloud, that's something that I'm quite fond of. Hopefully we'll get to Spring Security and production. We'll see. Dan and I just did this as a 4-hour webinar last week, and I think we got to about Spring Cloud.
This is a much shorter version of that.
Yes, we have condensed and shrunk some things out, but that's the general gist of it. So essentially what we're gonna do is we're gonna ping pong back and forth, and in many cases I will be sort of the audience stand-in, I guess. I don't think we'll have time for live coding today just
we'll have
because
some live code on the slides.
That's true, but we won't actually break out of this. But we also do encourage you to ask us questions. Right? That's one of the things that I love to do is, you know, I get to teach in the fall. I've got my grad students coming up here in a few weeks. I'm very excited to get back in the classroom. I love the back and forth and the Q&A, so take advantage of the fact that we're here live.
If we're in a section about web apps, let's get the questions out about web apps and talk about them then. We don't need to wait.
No, just, you know, show up your hand, yell at the question, we'll repeat it for the recording and we'll go from there. And then we won't be taking a break because we'll be done. So, getting started with Spring Boot.
All right, so
Dan, I built an application for scratching an itch the other day, and I was wondering, like, do I have to actually reboot every single time I make a change? Is there a better way to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know some people have heard of this, but in case you haven't, Spring Boot includes an additional set of tools that can make your development experience a little bit more pleasant. They're the Spring Boot Dev Tools, and this is a module that you can go ahead and select from start.spring.io, or if you're an existing application, you can go ahead and add this Spring Boot Starter. And it does a couple of things that people may not be aware of. So if we go ahead and add that as a Maven or Gradle dependency, we can do it after the fact that the project's already been created. One thing that it does is it adds a bunch of sensible defaults. So if I'm in a development environment, there are certain things that I would want to set. I would want to go in, if I'm building an application that uses something like Timeleaf, I would not want to have that cache on because I'm in development mode. I want to constantly be reloading my application and seeing those changes. Big fan of GraphQL, I talked about that this morning. I may want to enable the graphical user interface so I can go in and test my queries out. Instead of having to go in and set those by myself, if I'm in DevTools, if I'm using that, it's just going to assume that I'm in development mode and kind of provide those sensible defaults for us. So that's one thing that I really like. Obviously, another big thing is being able to reload the application when my code changes. You can do this in IntelliJ. There are a couple settings that you want to set in IntelliJ. If you're using something like Spring Tool Suite or VS Code, you can also do that there. But in IntelliJ, you just want to click a couple of checkboxes, and once you do that, you can go ahead and any change to your code will automatically restart the application for you. Now, I know me, I'm sitting there writing code, it keeps restarting. I kind of hide that console window because it starts to bother me after a while. But once it's there, once it's down, now you know you never have to worry about restarting your application. You can just kind of go test things out. So, big fan of that. So, problem. We want to upgrade to Spring Framework 6, Spring Boot 3, all the newness. There's a whole bunch of cool things going on there.
Right.
But it's always not that easy. You have managers, you have those architect types who are in your way.
Hey, we're very reasonable people.
Sometimes. They're also skeptical.
If we've had our coffee.
They're skeptical too.
Well, there is a little bit of that.
So we have all these walls, kind of roadblocks in our way.
Yeah.
How can we get by that?
No, that's a good question. So a huge part of this really is reminding people that there's features and functionality here. You know, I haven't met too many people who don't want a constantly improving application, and we can get some things for free just by upgrading. That's a huge win for us. I like these sort of low-hanging fruit kinds of things. Now, we do bring in baseline support for Java 17 and all the language features that come along with that. That's a pretty huge win here. If you were in the keynote this morning, you saw native executables. If you've ever thought, gee, I wish this app was smaller and was faster, guess what? That can be available to you. Observability, if you're doing any kind of distributed application and you don't have good observability in place, you know how challenging that can be. You've also got support. That's the one that tends to get manager and architect attention. Do you have support? All right, so if you don't have a contract, then you're talking about end of support in November of 2023. Which means essentially like next week, because time is flying. I don't know how we got to August already. How did that happen? You know, my son starts school next week. This is just crazy to me that the summer's already essentially gone. And now you get a little longer support with Spring Framework writ large. That's taught into December of 2024. But it's important to understand these roadmaps. And so this is the kind of thing that you can just sort of casually drop in your architect's inbox, and usually they will respond to something like that. Again, managers also tend to look at that and go, oh, wait, what do you mean this is going to be unsupported? You know, and away we go. Again, you get a little longer support with Spring Framework itself, but understand that time flies. You know, I've been in a lot of big enterprise organizations, and one of the things I hear a lot is, you know, we're a big ship, it takes a long time to turn. Cool, I get that, I appreciate that. That means we need to start planning now. You know, not waiting another year and go, oh, wait, yeah, we should probably do something about this. The other thing that I want to emphasize here is basic maintenance is important. Right? If you have a car, you realize that you have to change the oil. Well, I guess if it's an internal combustion engine. If you've got an electric vehicle, then I guess that goes out the window. But for those of you that still have combustion engines, you got to change the oil. That's a fairly cheap, fast kind of thing. And now you can kick the can down the street a little longer if you want. But if you go too far, you go from what's a fairly simple problem to, catastrophic failure, I need a new engine. And all of a sudden, that gets a lot more expensive. And that's something that people don't appreciate. I spend a fair amount of time on airplanes. And one of the things that's amazing to me is air travel is very, very safe because there's a lot of prescribed routine maintenance that goes into that. I don't think any of us would get on an airplane if the airline said, oh, don't worry, we haven't done any maintenance for the last 3 years, because the plane works. So we didn't feel the need to change anything. That's the excuse I hear a lot in organizations. Well, everything works, so we just poured concrete over it, so why would we possibly need to upgrade? So to me, these are huge parts of it. You've got security fixes, you've got a lot of things that we need in order to maintain the safety we have in our applications. Please work in small steps. I think this is where we get in some trouble, is we're like, well, I don't want to do this point upgrade, I want to wait. And all that does is make the problem worse. Because now instead of having something that's relatively straightforward, drop this in, minor changes, if you wait 6 months, a year, 2 years, oh my gosh, now a lot has changed. This has become a much larger lift than if we had done it bit by bit. It's sort of that if I pick up the house a little bit at a time, a little bit here and there, that's a lot simpler than, we haven't done anything for 6 months. This is a much bigger problem. I am not a fan of big bang changes. I have been a part of some big bang cutover type projects. They are not fun for anyone. This is scary. This is the kind of stuff that makes people go, ooh, yeah, no, let's not change anything. So to me, this is a pretty important step that we do these bit by bit upgrades over time.
Yeah, and I will say too, so Java as a whole is moving pretty fast, right? We've moved to this new cadence where Java's getting released every 6 months. Spring is, Spring Boot's right along with that. So Spring Boot is keeping up with the changes that are going on in the Java ecosystem. No longer can we just live in this era where, all right, we're going to stay on Java 8 for the rest of eternity, right?
There's a Java 8?
There is, and people still use it.
There are still people on Java 6.
It's true. We found that out.
I guess we found that out about a month ago.
All right, so we've got some kind of backstory there. We understand how to approach our managers, our architects. We got some leadway. We're allowed to upgrade certain apps. We want to upgrade those apps to Spring Framework 6, Spring Boot 3. Not sure where to start, how to go about this.
Well, congratulations on your successful influence campaign. That's a very important thing as both an architect and a senior developer, being able to influence people. Step 1, please upgrade to Java 17. That's where you're going to have some of these mechanical switches in terms of packages being renamed. You're going to want to make sure on the latest and greatest version of 2.7, and then double check all your project dependencies. All right, there's certainly going to be some properties that have changed. Take advantage of the properties migrator. A lot of what this boils down to is, hey, some import changes have changed thanks to some lawyering, I guess would be the polite way to phrase it.
Changing companies.
Yeah. It's above our pay grade,
It is,
I guess
yes.
is the way to say that.
Well, mine at least.
Well, certainly
You're an
mine as well.
architect.
I mean, there's architect is not that much up. A lot of this, frankly, can be done by our IDE. It's pretty impressive what the IDEs can do these days. So some of this is not nearly as daunting as it may first appear, and at least some of these are fairly mechanical changes. It's not a full-on rewrite. There are really good guides out there. I strongly advise you to familiarize yourself with the guides. So that's something I would take a peek at. We've also got, of course, the migrator, the rewrite, open rewrite. So we've got recipes in place for handling some of these things as well. So it's not nearly as daunting as it may first appear. Take advantage of what your tooling can do for you. Once again, work in small steps. Small steps are your friend. Right? I'm not a huge fan of let's completely blow everything up and start over and see what happens, what could possibly go wrong. I'd rather take these little baby steps and have a little better night's sleep. Do not do big bang changes. That way lies madness.
Great.
Web apps. I love web apps.
Yeah, who doesn't?
It's my favorite things in the world.
All right, let's see. What's our first problem here?
All right, so Dan, I worked on this application, my little play app that I've been dinking around with, and beautiful people like Glenn have helped me with that, as well as you and Deshaun and others. I need to do some validation. I have certainly worked with custom validators throughout my career, and I know how much fun it is to write a validation framework, but there must be a better way.
These days, anything that I have to write, I always look first for has somebody else smarter than me fixed this problem?
Smart.
And usually the answer is yes, so I'm going to lean on them. So in Spring, the Spring framework provides support for the Java Bean validation API. And what does that look like? So this used to be a part of the web dependency, the Spring Boot Starter web dependency. It's since been pulled out. So if you want to include this in your project, when you're at start.spring.io, you can pick validation as a dependency. If you're kind of adding it to an existing project, you need this validation starter, and that will bring in the validation support. So what does that look like? Here we have this create method where we're taking in an event. So I have an event where, and I think this should be a coffee, but we'll see in a second. I'm taking in some form of data that I need to go ahead and use to create a new thing, a new resource in the system. Yeah, I thought this was coffee. So I have again, just a coffee that's coming in. We're gonna delegate to the coffee service to create it. Now in the happy path route, I'm going to send a request to /API/coffee. I'm going to fill in all of the data here. So I've given it a name, I've given it a size, I've given it a price and a cost. If we go ahead and go through this, everything's going to work fine. But as we know, this is not always the case, right? Our users are going to send us bad information.
They don't cooperate?
They don't cooperate,
oh,
no.
Man.
Sometimes people actually try and break systems. So
who would do such a thing?
So here I have a name where the name is empty, and I have a price where it's $199. I don't know about you, but outside of Starbucks, that shouldn't be that much. So we need to validate what's coming in. I want to make sure that the name is not empty and that the price is a little bit lower than that. So how can we do that? So again, I'm using that validation starter. I go into my method here, and before the request body, I say, hey, this is use the @valid annotation. So now Spring is going to go, okay, I need to validate this before the request can go through. And how does it validate it? Well, it looks at the object. In this case, it's a record, and we can put some validation constraints on it. There are a whole bunch of constraints. You can look in the documentation for that. But here I'm saying, hey, that name, I want you to make sure it's not empty. It can have any value in it, but just make sure it's not empty. And then on the price, I'm saying, hey, make sure it's a max of 10. If we go over that, like 199, I want you to throw an error. So what does that error look like to the client? Well, by default, it's going to throw a 400, a bad request, and say, hey, this failed. There were 2 problems with it. Now, this is great, but I want a little bit more detail, right? I want a little bit more insight into what happened there. What are the constraints that are failing? So we can go ahead and include these 2 properties to get some more information out of it. But as we saw earlier, there's the Spring Boot DevTools, which I'm now saying you should include in every project. Because remember, it's going to set some sensible defaults for us, one of which is those. So it's going to set those and say, hey, in dev mode, you probably want to see some more errors, right? And if we go ahead and send that request again, now we're going to get a lot more information. We see that it's a bad request, but here are the errors that are actually happening. Hey, that coffee price that you tried to set, you've hit the max price constraint. So here's the error for that.
That seems a little more user-friendly.
Yeah, a lot more. Yeah. And I didn't really have to write anything. I added a couple annotations. And
that's even better. Yeah. How many validation frameworks do you think you had to do?
I actually wrote one myself probably like 15 years ago.
And
it was not fun.
I did too. Yeah, I don't know why we felt that was such an important thing. We all had to have our own validation routine. So we're building all these APIs. We're building all these might be microservices, might be functions. Eventually, I'm going to have to call something that somebody else wrote. How do I go about calling someone else's API?
We have a lot of solutions for this in Java and in Spring, and this list keeps growing and growing, which is good. We have options. I like that. So in Java, we have some options. In Spring, we have access to a REST template if we are in a Spring MVC app. If we are in a Spring WebFlux app, we have access to the web client. In Spring Boot 3, we now have access to HTTP interfaces. We'll go through what that means in a second. And we just found out kind of in the last couple weeks or so that there's a new REST client that will be coming in Spring Boot 3.2. So let's talk about these. So we have the REST template, we have the web client, we have a GraphQL client as well. So if you're working in a GraphQL application, it's actually built on the web client. We have HTTP interfaces and the REST client. So I want to talk a little bit about these. So if you're in a Spring MVC application and you need to call another service, you can use the REST template. Now, I often get a lot of questions when I do demos, like, hey, I see you're using the REST template. I thought that was deprecated. And that's not the case. It's not deprecated. It's just feature complete. You can see down here in a note, as of 5.0, this class is in maintenance mode. All it means is it's feature complete. It's not deprecated. If I'm in a pre-Spring Boot 3.0 application, I have no problem using REST template. So if you're in that type of application, you can always reach for REST template. How do you do that? Well, you need a REST template. You need an instance of a REST template. And actually, you don't even need to do this anymore. The REST template builder is something that will be in the application context. So you can create a new instance from there. But you can create an instance of the REST template. Here we have that. And then in my coffee controller here, I'm getting access to that instance that was created for me. And then I can use it to go off and down here on the REST template, get for object, I'm calling some API and the return type is a string. So this is great. I have a way to call another service using the REST template in my Spring MVC application. So the next thing is a web client. I really like the web client. If you're using a Spring Webflux application, the web client has this really nice Fluent API, has a whole bunch of options, and allows you to, again, call another service. What that looks like is you need to create an instance of that web client. So here I'm saying web client.create, and I'm giving it a base URL. So that's the URL of our API that we need to call. And then you can see we have the client.get, and then we have this nice Fluent API where we can kind of chain those methods together. So that's the base URL. The random.json is the URI we're calling. We're saying, hey, retrieve this, and when you're done, I want you to take the response of the body and turn it into a mono. Here's the type of class that you're going to use. So also, there's a GraphQL client. We have, again, it looks very similar to the web client because it uses the web client underneath the hood. Here, I'm saying, hey, here's the base of it. Go ahead and build it. Set the GraphQL client equal to that. Now, I'm writing a test here, or this, no, this isn't even a test. This is just a regular method. And I'm saying, hey, use the GraphQL client, take that query, and go ahead and send it off. We're going to retrieve that, and whatever comes back, we're going to turn that into an entity list, and that is going to be made up of country. So that's a way that you could do that, and then here I'm just using that in a command line runner to go off, get a whole bunch of countries, and then save them into a database. And then we can use it here. Again, it's in the application context, so we can go ahead and use it. So HTTP interfaces, new in Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6. It allows us to kind of simplify some of the things that we were just doing. So the REST template is great. The web client is great. At least from the REST template standpoint, I always go through the API documentation, and I'm always not sure which method do I use because there's so many methods. There's so many methods that are overloaded, and I'm like, I'm not quite sure. And then you start to add in like headers and different response types, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. So basically, I have to like reach for that, all the different methods, and write that low-level implementation myself, right? All I want to do is call another service, get a response. That's the bulk of what I'm doing, right? So what HTTP interfaces allow us to do is just define the contract. So here I'm saying, hey, I have this thing called a coffee client. What I want to do is use the @getExchange. There's a top-level HTTP exchange annotation. But what we're saying is the random.json is the URI we're going to call. Then we define the contract of the method. The really cool part here is the what's on the left there. This is the return type, which is coffee. This is going to determine whether this is synchronous or asynchronous. Right now, this is just going to be a blocking operation, but if you had like a mono of coffee, this will be an asynchronous operation. So based on the return type, it'll either block or not block underneath the hood. So all we've done is define the method. We haven't defined an implementation of calling another service and getting a response, but Spring is going to take this and turn it into an implementation at runtime for us, which is really cool. So there's a little bit of boilerplate you have to do. I never remember how to do this. I have a live template in IntelliJ to just kind of spit this out for me. And I think one day this may actually be baked into the framework, but for now you have to do some setup. You're just saying, hey, I'm creating a client with the base URL, and you're creating an HTTP service proxy factory. So once that's created, now back in my coffee controller, I can say, hey, I need an instance of that coffee client. I can use it, and I could say, hey, coffee client.random. And again, I haven't written any implementation of calling that coffee service. And again, that was for one method. Imagine a service where you had to call like 10 different methods. All you're doing is defining the contract, Spring's turning it into an implementation for you at runtime.
I really like it when someone else does the work for me.
I know, I think that's the theme. Yes?
Is there a difference in terms of like reasoning why you use it between the HTTP client and like the Spring Cloud OpenFA client?
So the question was, is there a difference between the HTTP interfaces and something like OpenFane? There are some other, I believe there are other features in OpenFane that are not in the HTTP interfaces yet. I don't know that I would reach for one or the other right now. I guess it would be on a case-by-case basis, but I think everything that you can do here, you should be able to use. So. Good question, though. So this is the REST client. This is the new stuff that is not there. And this is coming in Spring Boot 3.2. So I said I don't mind using the REST template, but one thing I like about the web client is that you get this nice fluent API, right? Well, you don't get that in the REST template. And if I want to use the web client in a Spring MVC app, then I need to bring in this other dependency, right? I always don't like bringing in dependencies to use one little thing. I'm bringing in like all the stuff that comes with Spring Webflux, and yes, I understand you can kind of exclude things, but most people don't. They just bring in the entire dependency just to use the web client. Well, now we have this REST client, which gives us a similar fluent API. You can see here we're just saying, hey, REST client get, here's the URI, go ahead and retrieve it, and when you're done, I'm going to take the body, that response, and turn it in, the type that we're expecting is a string. And then there's an example of retrieving something and turning it into a bodiless entity. Cool, so that's the REST client. There's a really good blog post on the spring.io blog if you're interested in learning more about that.
And that's coming in which version again?
Spring Boot 3.2, Spring Framework 6.1 later this year.
Fantastic. All right, so what the heck's going on inside my application? You know, used to be in the old days, I could just put a breakpoint in, and I could just walk my way through the code. Now I can't do that because I may not even have access to some of this code.
Don't you just log everything? Isn't that what
Well,
you do?
obviously, you log every possible thing, including lots of personally identifiable information. I hear that's a best practice.
That's really good, yeah. So one of the big themes in Spring Framework 6 was bringing observability support for Spring applications. Really a unified observability API for both the frameworks and the projects. This is really the interconnection between metrics, logging, distributed tracing, which you previously had to bring in using something like Spring Cloud Sleuth, you now get kind of out of the box with this. And so what does this look like? So I have an example application here where I'm creating a web app, I'm using the Spring Boot actuator, I'm using Docker Compose support, and I'm bringing in Zipkin to enable some span and trace IDs. So I'm doing this in, I believe, this is just a regular app. And then I go in, and for the actuator, I'm going to open up and expose all the actuator endpoints. I'm going to show some details for the health, and then I'm going to set my sampling probability to 1.0. If you don't do this, then it's really not collecting some of the things underneath the hood. Again, 1.0 is something I would set in development mode, maybe not in a production mode. That's a number you can kind of fiddle with in production. But as I'm doing this, now I'm collecting a bunch of data on things that are going on underneath the hood. And Spring is collecting metrics on a whole bunch of things, like what's going on with your JVM, what's going on with the OS, what is going on with all the HTTP requests happening in your app. And so now, once that is turned on, I can go into Zipkin here, or any other tool that you'd like, and I can go ahead and check out, I have an HTTP GET to /API/events. And if I go in there, I can see information about that request. This in and of itself may not be extremely helpful in this case because there's nothing going on with this. But if you're having problems in your application with, say, an HTTP request, you could start to drill down and find out where problems are. Imagine a request that has to call off to multiple other services and aggregate all of that data together. This can do that now. It can take distributed tracing and say, I know that had to call service A, service B, service C, and then aggregate that data together. If that were the case, it would show all of those calls in here, and you can start to identify where the problems are. So in and of itself, observability was a huge theme in Spring Framework 6, and throughout all of the different projects in Spring, there are now metrics that you can collect. I talked about GraphQL this morning. You can do this in GraphQL as well. But just a whole bunch of information that give you more insight into your application. And what I really like is just the observability API. We'll actually do a demo of this on Thursday in our other talk, but being able to use the same API that the framework is using underneath the hood. And it's just so simplified that we can really start to take advantage of the same things that the framework is doing underneath the hood. So.
For the record, please don't log personally identifiable information, please, I beg you. And of course, keep in mind that personally identifiable information, sometimes it's not in and of itself until you combine it with other data, and all of a sudden those 3 bits together is now personally identifiable. So please, be careful. So.
All right, databases.
Databases. So databases are an interesting topic for me because when I was a young developer, I did just enough SQL that they wouldn't let me do SQL anymore. And that was basically when I became a UI developer. And so I was so thankful when things like Hibernate came along because all of a sudden I didn't have to a lot of SQL, and thank goodness for all of the things hiding inside of here, or else I would be in a world of hurt. I could write an application that can actually talk to a database, and Glenn even helped me get it talking to a real database instead of just doing this in-memory H2. So, I mean, I don't know, Dan, you and I have been doing this long enough to remember when it was really hard, and there was a lot of stuff that went into talking to a database.
Does anybody remember just talking to a database in plain Java without any frameworks? Yes?
Jar does, I know
Oh,
that.
yeah. So you all have war wounds from that. That was not fun, right? There were a lot of things that you had to think about, right? You had to make this connection to a database. You needed to know where it was. You have to open a connection. You have to close a connection. Then you have all the APIs in kind of older Java that, hey, how do I actually write a select statement? How do I execute that query? How do I turn it into a bunch of objects, right? And then there are connections that you need to make to this database, but a connection to a database is not a real-world connection. I need to think about things like connection pooling. And so there are a whole bunch of things that you have to think about when you just want to talk to a database, which, as we were talking about the other day, is pretty much every app on the planet, right?
You know, when I was in college, I talked to my advisor one day, and I said, you know, Jim, why did you go back and get your PhD? Because he'd worked in industry for many years, and then went and got his PhD and came back and taught. And he said, Nate, I got tired of building the same application over and over and over again. I said, well, what do you mean, Jim? He said, Nate, all I've been doing for my entire enterprise development career was putting front ends on databases. And I did not appreciate that until I got in the real world. And I think it was my second or third project where I went, oh man, I'm just putting front ends on a database. And you know, the implementation details change. Like sometimes it was, oh, it's a web front end. And then it's a web front end written in JavaScript. And we're talking to this kind of data store and that kind of data store. And we got very excited because there's lots of data stores. But yeah, no, it's all the same thing.
Yeah. So thankfully, we have the world of Spring, and it is going to help us with this problem.
Thank the maker. So I'm getting started on an application. I need to talk to a database just to kind of get this thing up and running and play around, make sure I'm even going down the right path. What do I do?
If you've never done this before, it's amazing how easy it is. And this is really the power of Spring for me was when I was getting started. It's like Spring Boot just kind of makes this easy for us, right?
It's almost like cheating.
It is a little bit cheating. So auto configuration comes in and really saves us. So connecting to a database with Spring Boot is really easy. The quickest way to get up and running is by selecting something like an in-memory database like an H2. So what does that look like? I go to start.spring.io, I pick a web app, I choose some type of data layer. In this case, I'm just saying, hey, I need Spring Data JDBC, and I'm choosing the H2 database. With these bits, I can go ahead and download that project. I don't have to do anything. I can just run that project, and you'll see down there, there's a couple things going on, one of which is a Hikari pool. So this is a JDBC connection pool happening, right? We didn't have to think about that. I didn't have to think about, do I need to open this and close it, or what's happening there? That has been started up for us. There's a connection to a JDBC H2 in-memory database with some long UUID name. That is some name that is being generated for us. And then it says, hey, there's also an H2 console available. So if you need to see, if you need some insight into your database, that is available for you. So all of this happened. We didn't set up any properties. Again, this is kind of Spring's auto configuration behind the scenes, kind of seeing what's on the class path and setting these things up for you. So this is great, but you may need to go in and change a couple things. Maybe you don't want some random name for your database, or so you can go in and set a couple properties. You can just say, hey, my data source name is this, and I don't want you to generate one of those long, unique names. So if you set these properties, run it again, there's your in-memory connection to that sessions database and everything. Again, the H2 console is ready for you to use. So really easy, just by choosing the right dependencies, I'm connected to a database. And again, in the kind of MVP world, let me just get something up and running really quickly. This is a great start. The H2 console gives you that insight. So if you go to localhost 8080/H2 console, you can go ahead and log into that. And you can see all the information about your database and also run some queries if you need to. Cool.
Well, that's great for just kicking the tires, seeing if my model makes sense, playing around, doing some stuff on my box, works on my box. But eventually I'm going to have to connect to a production database because I don't want to have this data. I want the data to still be there maybe in the future, you know?
Yep. All right, so hey, connecting to a database like something like Postgres is just a few lines of configuration, right? We need to set that JDBC URL. So in this case, I have a Postgres database running on my local host. The database name is coffee. Here's the username and password. If I go ahead and set those properties, run the application, you can see that we are now connected to that database. So this is great if I had a Postgres database running on my local laptop. What if I don't? Well, I can use something like Docker Compose, and I can say, hey, here's an image for Postgres Alpine. Go ahead and map port 5432. Here's the username and password. I have to remember to go ahead and start Docker Compose up before I run my Spring app, and things will work fine. But as we saw this morning, and we've talked about before, there is a new Docker Compose module. What I really love about this is it takes care of a couple things for me. Like I said, most of the time I write a Spring Boot application in Java, and it's talking to a database. What I forget to do when I start the application is, oh yeah, I forgot to make sure Docker's on one. I forgot to run Docker Compose up. And then two is I had to create the properties to connect to that database in my Docker Compose file and in my Spring Boot file because I need it in my application.properties. Well, what the Spring Boot Docker Compose module is going to do is when you run your application, it's going to go ahead and run Docker Compose up for you. And it's also going to copy those properties from that Compose file into the environment. So I don't have to duplicate those in both the Compose file and over in the application.properties. So I'm a big fan of the Docker Compose module support in Spring Boot 3.1, and not just for databases, right? This is any service that I want to go ahead and run on my local machine, and it just gets us closer to that path of, let me clone a repo, run it on my laptop, and I don't need to set anything up. So big fan of that.
I always forget that I stopped Docker for some reason, and
I know.
then I need to restart it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a fun one. All right, well, that's cool, but I remember as a young developer hanging out with our DBAs on a project, and they didn't like vowels, and they had these strange standards that they applied to all of the names, and so it made sense to them, but I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. I'd see the actual model, I'm like, I don't even know what table this is. What does this correspond to? And then you'd have to have your DBA to developer, Rosetta Stone or something. So I never really dealt with all of that as a developer, but I'm playing around with this application I've been working on, and I kind of do need to generate something.
You can't give them your laptop and say, write some
No,
SQL.
and I don't have a DBA.
Yeah, that's true.
I have to, the role of DBA is played by me.
Glenn.
Well, Glenn got me started, for sure, but then he's like, this is as far as I can take you.
All right, so how can we run some DDL out locally? So we can create a script in our source main resources called schema.sql. In the instance of the H2 database, anything that's an in-memory database, we'll go ahead and automatically run this for you. So we have a DDL script here that's basically just going to create a table called coffee with 3 columns in it. And if we go ahead and connect to a real database, and I hate saying real, but people know what I'm saying. H2 is a great database. So, but if we're connecting to something that's not an in-memory database, then we need to set one little property here, which is that spring.sql.init mode, set it to always. Now we will say, okay, you've given us permission to go ahead and run that schema.sql automatically for you. So that's great, but we can do more. We can also insert, it's not just for creating tables. We can also go ahead and insert some data. So if you want to bootstrap some data that way, you can do that there as well. And then we go into our database and we see those records.
Bless your heart.
All right.
All right, so I remember the first time I was introduced to the CRUD moniker, and it took me a little while. And I'm amazed, a few times I'll throw it out there, and it is clear people don't entirely understand what I'm saying, but I don't want to have to write, read, update, delete, create for every single thing. It gets a little monotonous. It's like having getters and setters for everything.
That sounds like fun though, doesn't it?
No. Dude, I'm an architect. I want to just drink espresso and draw boxes.
Cool, so I'm sure everybody's heard of Spring Data. If you haven't, we'll just talk briefly about it. But it's really the umbrella project to many of the sub-projects that give you access to a specific database and allow you to do some really cool things as far as avoiding writing CRUD for all of your resources. So again, Spring Data's mission to provide a familiar and consistent Spring-based programming model. while retaining the special traits of the underlying store. So if you're moving from something like Postgres to Redis or Postgres to Mongo, that should be okay, and we want to keep the traits of whatever that specific database does, right? So what is Spring Data? There are some features, we'll go through a couple of them, but being able to just provide dynamic query derivation using these things called repositories, we can basically create an interface in Spring Data, a repository, based on the types in your system, and we get access to a whole bunch of features, CRUD including. You can do this based on domains, support for transparent auditing. So, hey, when was this particular record written? Who changed it, et cetera. And then integrating custom repository code. So there are a bunch of different versions of this. So we have SQL support, whether it's MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL, and then NoSQL, things like Redis, Mongo, Apache Cassandra. And there are a bunch of different modules. So this is where it may get a little confusing. If you go to the Spring Data site, there's a list of all these modules, and it's like, wait, which one do I pick? Well, there's a Spring Data Commons, so this is where a lot of the common functionality is contained. And then there are different modules. So two of the most popular ones you'll see, Spring Data JPA and Spring Data JDBC. There was a talk earlier on JPA's complex. Check out Spring Data JDBC. I'm a big fan of that. But these are different modules based on what your needs are. So in the JPA world, we're using Hibernate underneath the hood by default. And then there are a whole bunch of other ones. So things like MongoDB, Redis, Spring Data REST, Cassandra. And there are a whole bunch of community modules. So if you don't find one there, there are a whole bunch of community-supported ones for different types of database.
So basically what you're saying is if there's a data store, we can talk to it, and it's going to be nice and consistent for me as a developer.
Exactly.
I like that.
So you can check that out at spring.io. So if you're on start.spring.io and you type in Spring Data, you'll see all the different modules there that you have access to. And in this case, I think we were, yeah. So this was just an example of showing off a Spring Data repository. So I'm in this application where I'm working with these event classes, and I can extend the different repositories in Spring Data. There's a new one, if you weren't aware of it. There used to be just a CRUD repository. There's now a list CRUD repository, mainly for the methods that were returning iterables. So, hey, I want to find a list of all events. The CRUD repository would return an iterable, and I don't work with iterables. So I'm like, what do I do with this thing? How do I turn this into a list? So now there's a list CRUD repository, and those will return lists. So I want a list of events. So you just extend that repository and get all this CRUD functionality out of the box. So now you've avoided that step of writing CRUD for every resource in your application.
Love it.
And now you can focus on those special edge cases that the client has.
The client for my application is my family, which makes it really interesting to have product conversations with my family,
Right.
for sure.
All right.
Oh, Spring Cloud.
All right,
Spring
now
Cloud.
we're in your
I
wheelhouse.
love me some Spring Cloud. This is, as an architect, this is definitely my wheelhouse.
Cool. So we already talked about observability in general, but as we move to the cloud and specifically things like microservices, distributed systems in general, we need similar things. We need monitoring, circuit breakers, consumer-driven contracts, gateways, streams, oh my God, externalized configuration. The problem is you probably don't want every team reinventing the wheel, even like we talked about earlier with validation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I look at as an architect is I want my teams making good decisions when I'm not in the room. And there's lots of times that I can't be in the room. You know, I remember as a young developer, I thought, geez, my architects, we hardly ever see them. You know, they must not be very good architects. And then I got the title architect and had like 35 products dropped on my head the next morning and realized, we're spread incredibly thin. So we cannot be there for every single decision. I want to make sure that my teams are doing the right thing while also not, by the way, stepping on their toes. I need to empower them to do the right thing at the right time. They know the application and the domain better probably than I do, so by all means, we want them to make good decisions. So I want to give them that opportunity. We have this flexibility where I can come along and say, well, I need you to do this, but implementation detail is up to you, and you can swap that in or out as necessary. You know, that's one of the things I really appreciate about Spring is the fact that if you want to swap something out, it's fairly mechanical in nature, and I don't have to completely rewrite my application. I was involved once on a project where we changed databases. That wasn't a lot of fun, you know, and that's gotten a lot simpler today thanks to a lot of hard work by some really good engineers. There's a lot of ways to screw up a distributed application. And so one of the things I appreciate here is Spring is going to solve a lot of those problems for us. And that's a very good thing for our teams, very good thing for our company as well. And that means we're probably going to get a better night's sleep, which is a huge win.
Yep. Okay, cool. So our application that we've worked on is out there in the wild. It needs to react in a way to requests such as rate limiting. I don't want someone to just ping my app and be able to call it my API 1,000 times or whatever that is. I need to do things like rewrite responses and requests or route based on some aspect in the request. It sounds like a gateway to me. That sounds
Do you
like
mean
the
an
features
enterprise
of-
service bus?
Or that.
Ooh. Sorry,
Why are you bringing
too
up
soon.
old things?
Too soon. Sorry, I got bad memories of that. This is where Spring Cloud Gateway comes into the picture. And so this is a programmer-centric way to handle these kinds of things. You know, like let's say, I don't know, for the sake of argument, we rebranded and we need to change URLs. And we don't want all the old URLs to just break. That sounds like a good deal. Yep. I've been in the unfortunate situation of having to deal with some of these more enterprisey tools, and it was usually a huge pile of tickets and meetings and more tickets and email and going back and forth because there was always that gatekeeper that controlled the magical enterprisey thing, and that meant that, oh, I'm sorry, no, we can't refresh that for another 6 weeks because reasons. It's like, but I need this change to happen sooner than that. Well, that's too bad, sucks to be you. So this is essentially an ESB with inversion of control, and it puts us in control. So we have the ability to go in and just refresh configuration, and away we go. A lot of enterprise tools, frankly, are trying to be one of these and must be worthy to lift it, which is, I think, part of the problem with the way they fail. And I've certainly seen a lot of cases where it's like, okay, cool, I got my hammer, now somebody bring me a problem. I would much rather have you craft your own lightsaber, or to put it in another sort of analogy, build your own Swiss Army knife. What do you need it to do? It's up to you. Every application is going to have different needs. This is one of my frustrations with these one-size-fits-all tools. I don't know if you've ever seen a shirt that says one-size-fits-all. I don't know who this all person is because it doesn't look good on anybody. Well, maybe Jakob. He's in really good shape. But I want you to be able to put in what you want. So do you need the corkscrew? Do you need the nail file? Do you need which kind of blade? That's great. You're in charge of that. So you decide what this has instead of some enterprise organization trying to figure out how to, well, sell this to a C-level executive, all right? It's lightweight, it's simple, gets the job done. Big fan of that.
Yeah, and has anybody actually built out a gateway? Show of hands. All right, we got a couple in here. So you can do this in Java code, but you can also do this in just configuration. So really anybody can define these routes. You can build in all kinds of filters and predicates. And I think Spencer did a talk this morning.
Just going to mention that, yeah.
So currently, until this new version comes out, if you wanted to build out the routes in Java code, you need to use Spring Webflux. So it's based on building out routes in Webflux, but we have an MVC version coming very soon. And Spencer talked about that this morning. So if you haven't had a chance to check out Gateway and it sounds scary, I promise you it's not. It's really easy to set up, and it does a whole lot of powerful things. So. Cool. So we have some applications up. We need to monitor them, things like metrics or health information or the state of our application, right? How do we do that?
Yeah, well, as we said earlier, you know, used to be just go ahead and throw out a breakpoint. You can learn all sorts of stuff, but now there's a lot more going on. We got a lot more moving parts. And so Actuator builds a lot of this in for you. And so you can go ahead and see what's actually happening with your application. You can interact with that application as well. And one of the things that's really nifty here is you can build your own custom endpoints. There's some very powerful endpoints there right out of the box. If there's something that we didn't think of, fantastic. Go ahead, create your own. It is not that complicated. So if there's something special, you are in control. I remember many years ago, actually, one of the first things I did as an architect, we had an application team that had sort of kicked the tires on building something like this, you know, being able to give people a view into the health of their applications. And that was one of the first projects I had to architect. And I think, man, this would have been a lot simpler if we'd had something like this. So it's not hard to turn on. My Scratch and Itch project actually has that turned on, at least if you have the proper security role, thanks to Dan. So I think that's a nice way of being able to go in and say, hey, how's my application doing? What's going on? And of course, if I have a need, I can add my own custom endpoints. Very slick. One of the things that I really like about this is, again, it's very orthogonal, and it's logical stuff. It's things that you're going to want to ask about your project anyway. It's trivial to add. The thing that I love here is the pattern repeats itself. And even a simple architect can figure this out. And if you can't, little tip Glenn showed me, you can go into the initializer and select the dependency and then go to explore and you can actually see what that actually is, copy, paste it in. I actually did that. Deshaun and I were pairing on this and something wasn't quite working. We were like, wait, we must have gotten the dependency wrong in how we configured it. And we looked, no, it's right. And it was at that point it dawned on us, oh, we're not connected to the internet, so we can't pull down the dependency. So, oops. It's amazing some of these things you take for granted, right? That I'm always connected to the internet, and we were at a client site, and I had to like refresh something in order for my internet connection to come back. So we can just turn these things on, very straightforward. You can write it in whichever magic you like in terms of configuration. But I appreciate, again, the fact that this is easy to add and gives you some real insights into what your app's doing.
Cool. All right. So things in the organization, sometimes when we build out these applications, sometimes they fail. Not all the time. Nothing you wrote.
Nothing that any of us have ever
not in
written.
this
No.
room.
It's those other teams, those other developers.
Those other rooms over there.
Right,
yes.
yes.
So sometimes things are going to fail, but we need a way to handle that. How can we handle that?
Yeah, have you ever been on the interwebs and you run into a website where somebody didn't handle this gracefully and you got a stack trace?
Yeah.
Isn't that always amusing?
Cool.
I used to like capture those just as sort of a point of pride almost that, oh, I can see that you're using Tomcat. Cool. Oh, I see what kind of database you're using. Thank you for telling me that. Yeah, that's not a great thing. All right, we need to have circuit breakers, friends. And there are different implementations of circuit breaker. I know when Michael first defined this, it was a roll your own solution. We have multiple options here. Again, I cannot stress the importance of a circuit breaker. It works just like a circuit breaker in your house. If you overload a circuit, the breaker opens, preventing you from starting a fire or worse. This happens occasionally. My wife bought an air fryer, and one of the only spots in our kitchen where it made sense to put it was next to the microwave. And one day she was using the air fryer, and then she put something in the microwave, and then all the lights turned off in the kitchen. Oops. So then obviously the air fryer moved perfectly fine. The circuit breaker worked. It did its job. We need the same thing in our application. Now, the beauty of these software ones is it's a little smarter. It can actually go in and say, hey, are things getting better or not? If they are, we can go ahead and close the circuit for you and allow those calls to go through. But there's no point in us calling over and over and over and over again and getting the same result. I think that's allegedly the definition of
That'd be
insanity.
really cool if in your house, when you unplug
my
the air
God,
fryer,
right?
it just went, oh, okay, we
cool.
can turn on
We're
the
good.
lights again.
We're good. Yeah, no, it's all good. But yeah, no, you have to go down. At least when they flip, it's really easy to see which one to turn back on.
Yeah.
The harder problem is if you do have to change something in the house electrical-wise, and you got to try to play that game of which circuit breaker turns this off so I don't hurt myself.
Aren't you supposed to label them? I know I've mislabeled all of mine at home. So.
Yes. So they're labeled, but they're written with somebody who clearly was using their non-dominant hand to write them. That was my experience when I tried to figure this out. And then there's always the mystery of, well, why did they put that on this circuit? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I would never have guessed that was on the main bedroom circuit. Of course, that makes perfect sense. So this, again, is something that we have to have in our systems these days. It is not hard to add. We use the exact same configuration as you can guess. They're very straightforward. And then you configure your circuit breaker to do what you need it to do. You can make generic configuration. You can make specific configuration. It's totally up to you. You are in control of all of the little things that you would want to tweak. And then however you need your application to respond in these cases, whether that's a default answer, whether that's 42. That's always a good thing to return, right? Could be delegating to another call, who knows, cached result. And then you go ahead and wrap that vulnerable call with that circuit breaker. Now, we typically think of a vulnerable call as a network hop. I'm calling out to someone else's service, something I don't control. That isn't always the case, right? You know your application best. You can put this wherever it makes sense, wherever it will help you get a better night's sleep. So that, to me, is another part of this, is realizing there are spots in your app that need these kinds of things, so that we have this resiliency. I had a conversation with somebody about this recently. He's working on a presentation on that, and this is an important thing for us. Applications today, the expectations have gone up. There was a time where an application that was available Monday through Friday from 6 to 6 was acceptable. We don't live in that universe anymore for the vast majority of our apps. So we need to make sure that they can handle when bad things happen, because bad things will happen. Bad things find a way.
They do.
It's unfortunate for us.
All right, cool. So we built this application out. We're adding in all of these things like monitoring, circuit breakers. We also need to think about scaling our applications. hopefully, the hope is that we're going to get a lot more traffic than
Third
we
of internet
expected.
traffic.
There you go. We're starting to think about how we can scale these. We've moved to, in certain microservice architectures, we moved to an event-driven architecture, but we don't want to tie ourselves to one particular message broker. And I've seen this in many organizations. Never are you going to be on one broker. You're kind of mismatching between a whole bunch of different services. So how can we handle this?
Well, as an architect, my first question, of course, is what do you mean by event-driven?
That's true.
Because there seem to be at least 4 patterns that fall under that category of event-driven. It's a little bit of that, I'll know it when I see it, it's in the eye of the beholder. And to your point, I've been in those situations where either for tactical reasons or strategic reasons, we have to swap out a broker. Maybe we started with one and then, corporate came in and said, no, sorry, that's not our strategic direction anymore. We need you to change everything to this new one.
Somebody paid somebody to use something else.
I mean, I don't want to get into the how the sausage is made. It ain't pretty. It's above our pay grade, buddy. I hate to say it. So, yeah. So again, one of the things I love here about so many of the things in the Spring ecosystem is they give me that indirection layer. This is one of my favorite patterns as an architect. How do I have this indirection layer so that if I need to change something, it has a minimal impact on my teams? And so we don't have to do a ground up rewrite. That is a bad thing. So maybe you start with Rabbit because that's where you want to be, but then once we go to the cloud, we're going to use our cloud provider's version. That's perfectly fine as well. Spring Cloud Stream gives us the ability to swap those pieces out. All right, so I think basically every broker you can imagine is supported. Some of it's community driven, but I haven't seen anything yet that isn't, although I don't know, I'm sure there's something somewhere. But same basic concept. We say, I want to bind to this. This is the one I'm going to bind to. I'm going to go get Rabbit, and away we go. That makes our lives a lot simpler.
Cool. So our service is used by a whole bunch of different services in our organization. We can't just go wild, wild west and start introducing a whole bunch of breaking changes because, hey, we don't even know who's using this API. Somebody could be using it, and we're not even aware of that.
Right? Isn't that the fun part about making APIs? You don't even know who all your consumers are, and then you're trying to make changes, and you're like, gee, I sure hope I didn't break anything. I assume they'll scream if I made a problem. I've done that before. I was on one project where we had hundreds and hundreds of reports, and we were trying to figure out, are all these reports actually used? And so what we started doing was just turning them off and waiting for someone to yell.
Is that a pattern?
It is a pattern.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like scream-driven development or something.
Yeah, I like it.
You just see what happens, right? The amazing thing was a lot of those reports after we turned them off, nobody said anything. So it's interesting how that works. That's not always the best approach, though.
Right.
I don't like to make a change and then wait for one of my consumers.
Stream-driven development, SDD, not always the best.
That's not always a good idea. Spring Cloud Contract comes along and says, you know what, we should be using consumer-driven contracts. And this way we can defend both sides of that contract so that I know as the writer of this that I haven't broken a downstream service. A downstream service knows if I write against this contract, I am calling you correctly. I'm going to get the results that I expect. Big fan of this approach. We go ahead and add in the verifier.
That looks familiar.
Yeah, imagine it. It's amazing how the same pattern shows up again and again. It's almost like it was deliberate. I run this against my application. I'm going to get some stubs that I can then hand to my consumers and say, here you go, add this in. You go ahead and put a little bit of code onto your side and say, I want to run these stubs. And now you can write tests against that, and you don't have to mock things out. You don't have to try to figure that out. You don't have to guess what it is. No, I'm telling you this is what that contract is. That's a much better way to communicate, frankly, as developers. I like communicating with tests. I like communicating in that way, as opposed to us having a conversation and one of us misunderstands the other. Right? So this is a huge, huge win. And this is baked into my pipeline so that when something changes, we're alerted to that fact and we can modify that instead of going, oh no, what do you mean something broke? We've all been in that situation where a release happened and something bad came out of it. And it always happens at like 3 in the morning on a Saturday when we'd all much, much rather be asleep. And we all get dragged into this on a wonderful Bridgeline conference call somewhere, and everyone's like, what happened? Who caused the break? And it's a lot of not my fault, somebody else's fault. No one could have probably predicted this, could they?
Cool.
You want to talk about security?
Yeah, it's pretty important, right?
Well, but security through obscurity, right? That works.
Well, we're going to rule our own, right?
Oh, of course, because God knows we can do security. No, we can't.
If you ever roll your own security, I need you to step back, take a deep breath, and run out the door.
Those are some
Please
poor
don't
life
do that.
choices.
Yes. All right, so first one.
All right, so we're upgrading to Boot 3 and Spring 6. All of a sudden, there's going to be some changes there. I heard there are some changes, especially configuration. What do I got to worry about?
Yeah,
here?
so we talked about that guide earlier, that migration guide from 2.7 to 3. Definitely go through that if you're going to migrate to Spring Boot 3. One of the things there is we moved to Spring Security 6. So if you have Spring Security in your project, there have been some changes there. We also introduced some deprecated APIs, a new component-based configuration, and we'll talk about those really quickly. So one of the things I love about Spring Security is we go ahead and add it to our project, whether we pick it from start.spring.io or we add the Spring Boot starter. And by default, Spring Security is going to secure everything in our application. So no matter what we have in our application, if we go ahead and run it, we get this generated security password here, which is this UUID, and we have a username of user, and everything is locked down, so secure by default. But this is up and running, and we can use that, and that'll work. At some point, we're going to have to write our own configuration, right? We need to open this up to whatever we need to use in our application, and we need to provide some custom security configuration. The way that we used to do that is by extending the web security configure adapter. So you would extend that, you'd override that configure method, and here we can kind of do some things to customize the security in your application. So this is deprecated. We no longer do this going forward. We've moved to a component-based configuration. What that means is I'm going to create a configuration class, I enable web security here, and now I'm going to create a bean. That bean is of type security filter chain. It's going to take in HTTP security as an argument, and it's going to return that. So this is kind of the new approach, and this allows us to do some things, right? Allows us to kind of clean up our configuration. One thing it allows us to do is if we wanted to create two beans, we could, right? One, actually, I'll get to that in a second. So we have our security filter chain there, and then we have our user detail service. So we can also configure users in a component-based model. So I've got some users in my security filter chain here. There are some deprecations, so we move from authorized requests to authorized HTTP requests. We're also using request matchers instead of the old MVC and regex matchers. So that's now our kind of component-based configuration. And we can go ahead and really customize the security in our application. Here I'm saying, hey, if you visit the root endpoint, go ahead and permit anyone to access that. If you go ahead and visit /API /coffee /anything after that, go ahead and make sure that they have a role of admin. Anything else, just make sure they're authenticated. So I'm customizing my security there. And again, what this allows me to do is now I can create different beans, right? So I can create one for this H2 council security where I want to go ahead and allow this for dev. And then the other one is, hey, this is what I'm matching to as far as the rest of my application goes. When you create multiple beans, now you can set the order of them using the @order annotation. You could also do some things with like profiles and different environments. So this to me is a much cleaner approach. But again, if you're moving to Spring Boot 3 and you're using Spring Security, you do want to go through that documentation and find out what's changed.
It's easy enough that an architect can do it.
I think so.
So I
We'll
did
see.
it, although
yeah.
I did make one mistake in defining my roles
Yes.
as a single string because my eyes were not paying attention. So
Yep.
you should never code when you're tired.
That's true.
That
Well,
was
we
one
all
of my
do.
lessons.
We all do.
I know. I had clearly, this was not a good time of night for me to be writing code. Okay, so I know when I go to various sites, it'll say, hey, you want to log in with your GitHub credentials? Do you want to log in with your Google credentials?
Yep.
How are people doing this? Is this just
Well, we're writing this from scratch, of course. Yes,
obviously,
yes.
without a doubt.
So no, we don't have to do that in Spring Security, and we have OAuth 2 support here. So we looked at that security configuration before. If we go in here and use the OAuth 2 login, so I'm saying, hey, configure OAuth 2 login, and I go into my properties, and I have to go out to those different credentials. So like I'm using GitHub, I'm using Google, I gotta go sign up for credentials over there. But if I get things like client IDs and client secrets from them and fill those into my application here, now when I am asked to log in, this is the default form that kind of comes out of the box. Now I get that form login, but I also have the option to log in with OAuth 2. And again, this isn't something we had to roll our own, built into Spring Security, really easy to configure and set up.
Fantastic. All right, so by the way, I love the fact that in our industry we make acronyms out of acronyms. Every time I see this one, it makes me think about that. I've got all these wonderful REST APIs. I probably should secure those in some way, shape, or form. And let's go ahead and use a little JWT to make that happen.
Yeah, so there are, again, don't roll your own. Now, I
shouldn't roll my
I had
own?
the same problem. I was like, how do I do this? I started looking around because I've seen many implementations of this, and they were all like the same cookie cutter approach, but everybody's kind of rolling their own implementation. I did what anybody who works at VMware could do that has access to Slack, and I asked the Spring security team, hey, there's got to be an easier way to do this, right? And of course there is. This is kind of built in. I have a longer tutorial on this if you're interested in going through it. But the gist of things is that we have this JWT. The JWT is made up of the header, the payload, and the signature. So when we make a request over to our Spring application, we're basically going to get a 401 unauthorized, right? We can't access anything on the API. But if we have a JSON web token, so we log into whatever application here, we get back a JSON web token, now we can make a call to the application and everything is okay. So how do we do this in Spring Security? Well, again, just enabling something here in our configuration. We're saying, hey, I want you to enable OAuth 2 resource server. So we're setting some defaults here. We're saying, hey, go ahead and use JWT, and we have to do a couple things with like, hey, what is the, how are we going to sign those JWTs? There's different approaches to that. Again, that's kind of in the documentation. Once we do that, we can sign a JWT, generate a token, and send it back to the consumer. Also, there's the Spring Authorization Server. This will kind of take you to the next step. There's a whole bunch of more options at the Spring Authorization Server level, but just in Spring Security alone, you have that option to go ahead and use that. And with that, I think I'm going to jump over and come bring us down here.
I think if I saw the schedule right, Rob will be Ask the Experts.
I think he's there now. Is he? Is he there now with Josh?
I know he's there with Josh, but
All right.
okay. All right. So I know
So
there's definitely opportunities to get more in-depth questions answered.
And I wonder, is Josh Cummings talking on security too? So if he is, if he's not, he's here. Find him and bug him. He will absolutely talk to you about security all day.
Well, and I know one of the things that we mentioned during the keynote this morning is the hallway track. Take advantage of it. There are several of us floating around, so if we didn't get to your question today or something comes up, please track somebody down in the hallway. So don't be afraid to say, hey, let's go get a cup of coffee. That tends to work wonders, by the way. I think we all drink coffee.
I don't think I would ever turn down a coffee.
Never, never. And some of us even found really good coffee this morning, along with lots of other delectable delights. So anyway, Spring is huge. This is a blessing and a curse. You know, one of the challenges that I ran into as I was building this application was I would Google something and I would get like 5 different results, and it's up to me to figure out like which one's correct. And of course, they're all correct. They all work because one of the things Spring strives to do is be backwards compatible. And so then I would ping my, again, it's beautiful having the committers on Slack. I'm not going to lie. This is a huge advantage. And so I'll be like, hey, Glenn, what you doing right now? One of these days, I'm gonna have to sit down with these guys and actually have like a serious code review and then watch them tear my application to bits and pieces. But I'm willing to do that to learn, because that's the only way we learn. But it is big. There's a lot of stuff here, and it can be overwhelming. I hope over the course of the 70-ish minutes we've been chatting with you, we showed you something you maybe didn't know existed, and you now have some ideas on where to go when you run into these problems. I learned a long time ago as a developer, as Dan said earlier, if I start to write code and I think, wait a minute, I bet somebody else has already done this, they probably already have. If it's a common enough problem, somebody has solved it for you. It's always in our best interest to leverage those learnings where best we can. So hopefully, again, we showed you something here. These are all tools. Again, the challenge for us is knowing when to pick up which one. And sometimes the challenge is just being aware of the tool.
Yeah.
I didn't even know there was such a thing as blank, and so I thought I had to do this by hand. I actually started down that path on my application. I was going to make a map link, and so I figured out, oh, this is how I would call the map URL. This is no big deal. And then I thought, wait a minute, I can't have spaces. There's spaces in my address, so I got to strip out the spaces. Well, that's not a problem. I know how to do that in Java with strings, and I started writing the test, and I went, wait a minute. This is a URL I'm encoding. There has to be a solution for this. And guess what? There was. And so I saved myself from having to write a bunch of code that I would then be stuck maintaining and dragging along for the next however many years the application runs. So if you are in doubt, if you're sitting there going, God, there's got to be an easier way, there probably is. 5 or 10 minutes of searching around the interwebs might save you hours or days of work. That is a huge win for us, friends. So don't reinvent the wheel.
Cool.
Questions? We got like 2 minutes.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
On Spring aspects, just speak a little bit, Spring aspects. I'm just kind of curious if they're going to be deprecated or something like that. Just question one.
Spring aspects?
Aspects like,
Aspects are the core of the Spring project system. So when you pull in the Spring framework, which we have,
Oh, ALP? Yeah.
you get aspects that's there.
okay, so it's built in.
Yeah, so you are at the foundation level.
So yeah, even if you go to start.spring.io, pick no dependencies, cores coming in with that, that should be in there.
Okay. Okay. Question two. I thought I heard some about Spring AI earlier this morning.
Yes.
Yes, you did.
And I just want to hear a little more about it.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to play with it.
We
but
do
I know-
too.
Yeah,
We're gonna track down Adib.
I saw it. I was like, I got to play with that project. And I know Mark Polk's been doing some work on that,
Yeah.
especially in the Spring CLI space. So I'm with you. I'm interested. I get to do this for a living. I can't wait to get back and play with it and,
Yeah.
and talk about it. So
Yeah, I already cornered Adib and said, you and I are having a conversation about this. So you could do the same. He's here. One more.
Question? You can
Just shout.
You can
We'll
just
go ahead
shout.
and
I'll
repeat
repeat it.
Is there an overlap between the functionality of micrometer and actuator?
So the question was, is there an overlap with the functionality between actuator and micrometer? So the thing is that actuator is what you need to install to actually start collecting all these metrics, right? That's what brings in some of the micrometer stuff. If you don't, again, we're going to talk about this Thursday in our
Yes, we are.
talk, but I think that our goal is to get any application into production. The first thing you should include in any project should be the actuator. So that's the starting point. That's collecting all of the metrics that you need. Now, the observability support that was added is being added to the framework underneath the hood. So yes, if you want to know how many HTTP requests were sent, how many were failed, how many were a success, if you don't bring an actuator, you're not collecting those metrics. So.
Would you not extend the actuator to get the same functionality where you start like actuator is an extendable pattern, right?
Sure, you could include those libraries on your own and try to configure everything and do it, but it's much easier to just pull the
Could you
actuator.
get actuator to do some of what micrometer does? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, why was it not done that? Since we have a wholesome pattern here, why not follow that? And introduce another new way.
So with the new changes in the observability stuff, you can basically add your own observations on top of that. So I would just include actuator and then start to add your own observations wherever you need to like observe certain things. But if you want to dive further into that, let's talk about it.
The other thing you do is when you pull an actuator and then you start bringing in your favorite observation framework, the other thing that you're going to get is that the Spring projects also included more observations
Right.
within each project.
Right.
One of the things you'll get is you can enable not only the stuff that you're going to be doing through your own observations,
Right.
but you can say, I'm going to enable like what Spring data report.
I was just going to say that, yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, you don't want to have to go ahead and monitor all the things that Spring Data is already doing for you.
Yeah.
So these Spring projects are doing a lot of the collecting of these metrics, which you'd have to do on your own. You want to observe your own code, not any of the framework stuff going on, right?
Play like a Java champion. All right, well, friends, thank you so much for your
Thank
time
you so
and
much.
attention. Really
Appreciate
appreciate it.
it.
Cheers.